Good morning, everyone. In previous lecture, we have started with our third lesson, that is the Cop and the Anthem, which is by O. Henry. Now, I want to summarize the story, what we have seen. This is a short story which is by O. Henry. It is about a homeless man called Sophie who notices once in a cold night on his park bench that he has to try to do everything that is possible in order to get into prison for 3 months to survive the winter. And for that reason, he had done different attempts. His first attempt was to get there is to dine in an expensive restaurant and to tell the waiter afterwards that he cannot pay the bill. When Sophie goes into the restaurant, the head waiter has him thrown out directly because of his outward appearance. Then he made his second attempt. He throws a stone into a shop window, but this attempt also fails because the policeman doesn't believe that a real lawbreaker would stay still waiting to let himself voluntarily to be arrested. And when the policeman sees a man running along the road, he assumes that the running man must be a guilty person and pursues that man. In his third attempt, Sophie eats in a restaurant and says afterwards that he cannot pay the bill. But the waiter doesn't call the police and isn't interested in Sophie's anymore. Now we have to move towards his next attempt that we will check. Now, in this attempt, a nice looking young woman was standing before a shop window looking at the object inside. When very near stood a large cop. Now, what was Sophie's plan? To speak to the young woman. She seemed to be a very nice young lady who would not want a stranger man to speak to her. She would ask the cop for help, and then the Sophie would be happy to feel the cop's hand on his arm. He would be on his way to the island. So now he went near to her. So now he said to that lady, "Good evening, Bedelia. Don't you want to come and play with me?" Bedelia. Bedelia is the girl's name of the Irish, which means strength. So here he said that, "Bedelia, do you want to come with me and do you want to play in my yard?" The cop was still looking. The young woman had only to move her hand and Sophie would be on his way to place where he wanted to go. He was already thinking how wow he would be. The young woman turned to him. Putting out her hand, she took his arm. Now see, what was his expectation that if he is going to talk with a stranger lady that time, the lady is going to call cop and the cop, they are going to arrest Sophie and he will be there at his destination. But what happened? Here you can see the reply of the lady. "Sure, Mike," she said joyfully. "If you shall buy me something to drink, I would have spoken to you sooner." But the cop was watching. With the young woman holding his arm, Sophie walked past the cop. He was filled with sadness. He was still free. Was he going to remain free forever? This answer was not expected by the Sophie. So at the next corner he pulled his arm away and ran. When he stopped, he was near several theatres. In this part of the city, streets are brighter and hearts are more joyful than in other parts. Women and men in rich warm coats moved happily in the winter. So this time also the Sophie he was failed in his attempt. So now his next attempt. A sudden fear caught Sophie. No cop was going to arrest him. Then he came to another cop standing in front of the big theatre. He thought of something else to try. Now what to do? The question was there in his mind. He began to shout as if he had too much to drink. His voice was as loud as he could make it. He danced and cried and shouting loudly. And the cop turned his back to Sophie and said to a man standing near him, "It's one of those college boys who won't be hurting anything. We had orders to let them shout." Sophie was quiet. Was no cop going to touch him? He began to think of the island as if it were as far as heaven. He pulled his thin coat around him. The wind was very cold. In the last scene, we have seen when the Sophie discovers a young woman near a policeman, he sees his chance to get into prison. He walks towards the woman in order to harass her, but she behaves as if she wanted to talk to Sophie at the same moment and hangs on to him so much that he must shake her off at the next corner. Because this attempt fails, he behaves as if he were drunk in the proximity of a policeman. But the policeman ignores Sophie because all of the policemen had been informed that the students from the Yale are celebrating a party that night. Even his sixth attempt, namely stealing a man's umbrella, fails because the man had stolen the umbrellas from somebody else before. Now this sixth attempt we are going to see in the next page. Then he saw a man in the shop buying a newspaper. The man's umbrella stood beside the door. Sophie stepped inside the shop, took the umbrella and walked slowly away. The man followed him quickly. "My umbrella," he said. "Oh, is it?" said Sophie. "Why don't you call a cop?" "I took it." "Your umbrella. Why don't you call a cop?" "There's one standing at the corner." The man walked more slowly. Sophie did the same, but he had a feeling that he was going to fail again. The cop looked at the two men. "I," said the umbrella man. "That is, you know how these things happen?" "I, if that's your umbrella, I'm very sorry. I I found it this morning in a restaurant." "If you say it's yours, I hope you shall." "It's mine," cried Soapy with an anger in his voice. Means what? That man, he had also stolen the umbrella from somebody, and that's why he thought that Soapy is the person from whom he had stolen that umbrella. The umbrella man hurried away. The cop helped a lady across the street. Soapy walked east. He threw the umbrella as far as he could throw it. He walked to himself about cops and what he thought of them, because he wished to be arrested. They seemed to believe he was like a king who could do no wrong. At last, Sophie came to one of the quiet streets on the east side of the city. He turned here and began to walk south towards Madison Square. He was going home, although home was only a seat in the park. But on a very quiet corner, Sophie stopped. There was an old church. Through one of the colored glass windows came a soft light. Sweet music came to Sophie's ears and seemed to hold him there. The moon was above, peaceful and bright. There were few people passing. He could hear birds high above him, and the anthem that came from the church held Sophie there, for he had known it well long ago. In those days, his life contained such things as mothers and flowers and high hopes and friends and clean thoughts and clean clothes. Now the Sophie's mind was ready for something like this. He had come to the old church at the right time. There was a sudden and wonderful change in his soul. He saw with sick fear how he had fallen. He saw his worthless days, his wrong desires, his dead hopes, and his lost power of his mind.
He would pull himself up out of the mud.
And also in a moment his heart answered this change in his soul. He would fight to change his life. He would pull himself up out of the mud. He would make a man of himself again. There was time. He was young enough. He would find his old purpose in life and follow it. That sweet music had changed him. He thought tomorrow he would find work. A man had once offered him a job. He would find that man tomorrow. He would be somebody in the world. He would. Sophie felt a hand on his arm. He looked quickly around into the broad face of a cop. "What are you doing? Hanging around here?" asked the cop. "Nothing," he said. "You think I believe that?" said the cop. Full of his new strength, Sophie began to argue, and it is not wise to argue with a New York cop. "Come along," said the cop. "3 months on the island," said the judge to Sophie the next morning. In the end, student, we have seen when Sophie walks along the road, he suddenly stops in front of a church. The atmosphere created by the light shining through the colored windows of the church, and also by the organ music to be heard on the road outside the church, makes Sophie start thinking about his life. At the same moment as Sophie decides to start a new life, a policeman comes toward him and arrests him because he is not allowed to stand there. Sophie is condemned to 3 months in prison as he had wanted it all the time. So student, this is the end. When he wanted to change himself, when he heard the church anthem, so that time his mind got changed. He wanted to do something in his life, but at the same time the cop came and he felt that the person is arguing with him, and that's why he punished him, that he has to live 3 months in prison on the island. And same thing Sophie he wanted in the beginning. So student, if we want to analyze this story, so that time here is the analysis. Here we can see the Henry's sense of irony is on display from the very beginning of the story. As Sophie's annual migration, it is treated as a natural occurrence that is similar to the southern migration of geese. Sophie shares a kinship with his fellow New Yorkers, but the bitterly ironic fact is that he is headed to a much different island than his wealthy counterparts. Sophie remains a proud, dignified character who wants to preserve his independence despite his poverty. The comedic irony is that he plans to do so by going to jail. Sophie is a character with refined, expensive taste which suggests he was not always poor, and also that the poor are not so different from the wealthy, despite stereotypes of them as uncultured and uncouth. Despite his confidence in his ability to move fluidly through different layers of society, because he knows how to dress and act the part. The reality of Sophie's social status is embodied in his frayed trouser, which give him away. The comic over the top quality of Sophie's crime and admissions hint at his mounting depression and raise the story's stake. No matter how confidently he pursues arrest and how visually obvious his crime might be, all that matters is the police officer's perceptions of Sophie, suggesting that a man is only homeless if a person in a position of power above him thinks of him that way. Sophie envisions himself as a gentleman and considers this role beneath him, much in the same way that he was misidentified by a cop. Sophie misidentifies a character when he thinks he is above the role he must play. The stark irony, however, is that Sophie must engage in the behaviors of a masher in order to achieve his goal, thus making him into a masher himself in the process. There is a sense throughout the story that Sophie is doomed or cursed, suggesting that nothing he does can change the vicious cycle of homelessness in which he is trapped. Shouting at a cop causes a widely outsized response. The cop perceives him as an Ivy League student at a prestigious university, which further suggests that Sophie's fate is not in his own hands. It is only once Sophie performs his crime that he sees this fellow criminal for who is, shattering his confidence in his ability to identify individual based upon his perception of their appearances and the material objects surrounding them. This once again revealed to Sophie that he commits the same errors of perception as the people he encounters throughout the story. This is the story of a homeless man so inspired by an anthem that he resolved to pull himself up by his bootstrap and chase the American dream. The story screeches to a halt with a series of rapid fire exchanges that reward Sophie with the things that has eluded him to the entire story, but which is ironically the thing he no longer desires. This provides tragic irony and social commentary in tandem, as reader once again see that Sophie is powerless to escape from his homelessness and the way he is pursued by the world. At the end of the Cop and the Anthem, Sophie has an epiphany after listening to a song. The anthem of the story's title emanating from a church. while the church in O. Henry's story feels surprisingly void of its religious connotation. The anthem emanating from it does nevertheless symbolize hope for Sophie. He vows to pull himself out of the mire and make a man of himself again. When he hears this song, and O. Henry even goes so far as to say that the church anthem causes a revolution in Sophie. Perhaps his most tangible woe is that he will go into the New York's downtown district and find work. There was time yet, the narrator remarks while Sophie stares at the church, unscoring his new feeling of potential. One could even argue that the church anthem is a metaphor for the national anthem, and the feeling it puts in Sophie is symbolic of the promises of the American dream. Sophie is notably on the outside of the church looking in this scene, barred from the entrance by a fence. And yet the music he hears is so moving to him that he vows to change his life and chase life, liberty, and the pursuits of happiness that he is ultimately unable to. However, would suggest that the hope instilled in him by the church, and perhaps by the American dream itself, it's illusory for those at the bottom rungs of the society as Sophie is. The church anthem, the cop and the anthem refer to the symbol of the church anthem. So student, the cop and the anthem has only one character who is given a name, the protagonist, Sophie. Furthermore, no last name is given. It is made clear that Sophie is homeless, a member of the substantial army of underclass men and women who flocked to New York City during the earliest year of the 20th century. This is the short story. Narrative is set in an unstated day in the late fall, because the city trees' deciduous leaves are falling and there is a hint of frost in the air. And that's why the Sophie faces the urgent necessity of finding home, sort of shelter for the winter. He is psychologically experienced in thinking of Blackwell's Island, the local jail, as the homeless shelter, and the narratives show him developing a series of tactics intended to encourage the police to classify him as a criminal and arrest him. Sophie's attempts include swindling a restaurant into serving him an expensive meal, vandalizing the plate glass window of a luxury shop, repeating his eatery exploit at the humble dinner, harassing a young woman, pretending to be a publicly intoxicated, and stealing another man's umbrella. However, all these attempts are quickly exposed as failure. The upper class restaurant looks at Sophie's threadbare clothes and refuses to serve him. A police officer responds to the broken window but decides to pursue an innocent bystander. The dinner refuses to have Sophie arrested and instead has two servers throw Sophie out onto concrete pavement. Sophie's failure to earn his desired arrest continued. The young woman, far from feeling harassed, proves to be more than ready for action. Another police officer observes Sophie impersonating a drunk and disorderly man, but assumes that the exhibitionistic conduct is that a L student celebrating L L is university. L student celebrating a victory over Hartford College in football. And finally, the victim of the umbrella theft the item without a struggle. Based on all these events, Sophie despairs of his goal of getting arrested and imprisoned. With the autumn sun gone and night having fallen, Sophie lingers by a small Christian church considering his plight. As O. Henry described, even the small church has a working organ and practicing organist. As Sophie listened to the church organ play an anthem, he experiences a spiritual he experiences a spiritual realization in which he resolved to cease to be homeless, end his life as a tramp, afflicted with unemployment, and regain his self respect. Sophie recalls that a successful businessman had once offered him a job. Lost in revenue, Sophie decides that on the very next day he will seek out his potential mentor and apply for employment. As Sophie stands on the street and considers this plan for his future, however, a policeman taps him on the shoulder and asks him what he is doing. When Sophie answers, "Nothing, his fate is sealed. He has been arrested by for jurisdictions." In the magistrate court on the following day, he is convicted on a criminal and is sentenced to 3 months in Blackwell's Island, the New York City jail. So student, here we have finished with the chapter. Already the new words are given in the glossary in your textbook. If you have more doubt, you can ask me. You can drop your comment in the comment box. Thank you.